Okay, hi everyone. My name is Candace Teal, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Thank you so much for being here and attending our Nature and Mental Health webinar, where we hope to learn more about the relationship between the two. A couple of reminders before we get started. You all are muted and your cameras are off, so you can't be seen or heard. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box and we will go over them at the end. The webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything, it will be posted on our Conservation Nebraska YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. And then lastly, there will be a short poll that will pop up on your screen with just a couple of questions. These help Conservation Nebraska to improve on future webinars and events. So if you've ever been sitting at home wondering how to help with conservation, this is a great way to help with minimal effort. And then here with us today is Julia Torquati. Julia is going to share a little bit about herself and her work, and then we will get started with the webinar. So now we will hand things over to the expert, Julia, to get us started.
Thank you, Candace, and thank you for the introduction. This is the beginning of my 29th year at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Department of Child, Youth, and Family Studies, and it's my third year as the Buffett Early Childhood Institute Community Chair in Infant Mental Health. And so I'm really excited to talk on this topic because it's really the convergence of two of my passions, the influence of nature on children's development and well-being, and also infant and early childhood mental health, and then mental health more generally. So just to give you an overview of what to expect, we'll spend a little bit of talking about what is mental health, because if we want to know how nature is influencing mental health, what is it influencing? How do we define that? How do we measure that? And then what is mental health in infancy and early childhood, because that might be a little bit less familiar to some of you. What kinds of influences there are in mental health, and then how we do research on the associations between nature, mental health, and well-being. How do we actually determine whether there is an effect? And then finally, some discussion of how to use natural environments to support mental health of children and adults. So first of all, thinking about what is mental health, go ahead and just type your ideas in the chat. What do you think of when you hear the term mental health? How do you define it? Or what does it make you think of? Don't be shy. Okay, well, if you're coming up with ideas, go ahead and put them in the chat, but I'm going to put some things out here. Typically, when people think about mental health, the focus is on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and that's certainly a central part of it, but it's not a whole story. So I really encourage you to think about whole person, the whole person. So it's also physical health, and people sometimes talk about the mind-body connection, but even that doesn't fully capture it because mind and body aren't truly separate. We are embodied, we are one whole body, and our mental health is part of our physical health and overall well-being. Physical activity has a strong influence on mental health, and mental health also influences how active we can be. And so there are really reciprocal influences here. Mental health influences our social relationships, but our relationships also influence our mental health. And so it's tied with our contexts and our experiences as well. Okay, Grace says the chat should work now. Thank you, Grace. So mental health is also associated with our experiences and environments. So having supportive relationships is generally beneficial to mental health. Having conflictual relationships can have a negative impact on mental health. And of course, being socially isolated can have a negative impact as well. Major and minor stresses in our lives, trauma, as well as just the pileup of everyday hassles can influence mental health. And our physical environments are really important as well. So thinking about things like air quality, noise, light, being near water, those sorts of things. And if we want to look at more formal definitions, the CDC has declared that mental health is an important part of overall health and well-being, as I just mentioned. It affects how we think, feel, and act. and it affects how we cope with stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. And so it's tied to our behavior, which then is also tied to our mental health again. So it's really a reciprocal or dynamic process. And so the idea of well-being integrates physical and mental health into a holistic concept. And that's important to think about as we begin to think about how you study this. So are we looking at positive outcomes, for example, positive mood, or are we looking at diagnosis? So I have this representation. When I was looking for images of mental health, there are a lot of images of brain. So if you search mental health when you're looking for images, basically you are coming up with a lot of pictures of brains. So they might be line drawings, they might be scans, there might be brains with flowers coming out of them. But that is really limiting because the brain is a critical part of mental health and it's instrumental in so many different ways. But again, it's just not the whole story. And so this representation, I was thinking about it as all of these different dimensions of well-being. And if you're moving from the left to the right, those things can be harmonized and they can all be working together. Or as you're moving to the right, that's where things begin to get muddied. And so there are qualitative and quantitative differences between, having symptoms and having a diagnosis. So you can have symptoms of anxiety, but not have an anxiety disorder. And you can measure both of those things as outcomes to determine whether being in nature makes you feel less anxious or decreases the likelihood that you'll be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. But a diagnosis is qualitatively different because that's when symptoms are really disrupting your everyday functioning. So you can feel sad sometimes, but when you're depressed, that's really affecting your ability to carry out your day-to-day activities. So what are some of the most common mental health conditions among adults in the United States? So 11.2%, this is from 2020, and likely collected, I'm actually not sure if it was collected prior to the beginning of the pandemic. I just know that it increased substantially during the pandemic. This looks a little low for the pandemic statistics that I've seen. But so more than 10%, 11% of adults regularly having feelings of worry, nervousness, or anxiety. So those are the feelings or the symptoms. 12% taking medication for those same kinds of symptoms. And so you might be wondering why those numbers don't match. Well, we don't know if those are the same people. The people taking medication, maybe that is working for them and it's reducing their symptoms. We don't know if the 11.2% were taking medication or not, seeing a therapist or not. But in either way, it's not uncommon for people to have feelings of anxiety. 4% regularly having feelings of depression, but 10% taking medication for feelings of depression. And why is that taking medication higher? Well, it's probably working, the 4.4%. Some of those may be taking medication, some of them perhaps not. And 10% being counseled by a mental health professional. So those are symptoms. Now, mental illness among American adults, 1 in 5, so 21% of American adults are diagnosed with a mental illness. And it's more common among women and men, and it's more common among young adults than middle-aged adults or older adults. So our young adults are really experiencing some difficulties. I'm not sure if that has been consistent throughout the past several decades. But right now, we do know that late adolescence and emerging adulthood is an extremely stressful period of life, and the research bears that out as well. Now, a serious mental illness. So this is a mental illness that significantly disrupts your ability to carry out your day-to-day activities. So 5.6%, a smaller percentage, also more common among women and men, and also highest among young adults compared to middle-aged and older adults. And so if we're looking at these groups of disorders, anxiety disorders, mood disorders are the most common. And then 6.7% had co-occurring mental health and substance abuse disorders in 2020. Anxiety and depression and substance abuse tend to travel together. And so it's not uncommon to see those comorbid diagnoses. Okay, so what about children? I mentioned infant and early childhood mental health, and that might seem like a new concept for you. Well, I assure you, we're not talking about babies on therapist couches. This definition is from the professional organization 0 to 3, and this is a positive definition of mental health. So what does it mean to be healthy from birth to age 3? And then this definition actually carries through early childhood, which is birth to age 8. So it's really holistic. It is the gradual development of social and emotional capacities, including emotion regulation, self-regulation, and integration of feelings, thoughts, and behavior, so that kids can self-organize within and across context. So the key here is stability in their capacities, these abilities, but also the ability to adapt. So stability and flexibility at the same time. And so these are really important developmental tasks of early childhood. And when children are doing this successfully, we think of them as having good infant and early childhood mental health. So how does it develop? In relationships, in safe, stable, nurturing relationships that are consistent and loving and predictable. And because of the importance of safe, stable, nurturing relationships to mental health, documented over decades, the American Academy of Pediatrics proposed this eco-biodevelopmental model of health as a public health approach to addressing toxic stress. So healthy relationships can be a buffer to toxic stress. And this approach to health acknowledges the processes through which stress and trauma become biologically embedded and influence health, learning, and behavior across the lifespan. So if children are experiencing toxic stress in early childhood, that actually changes physiology. Most pronounced the neurological system, immune system, stress response system. But having safe, stable, nurturing relationships can buffer that. Now, you might wonder, I've mentioned self-regulation a couple of times. You might wonder why and why the focus on self-regulation. Well, it is a core capacity that's related to mental health. I mentioned the stability and flexibility. And so self-regulation is the ability to flexibly adapt your behavior, attention, emotions, and cognitive strategies in constructive ways in response to situational demands. So when children are in different contexts, there are different expectations for behavior. And self-regulation develops gradually over the first several years of life. I do mean gradually, because sometimes children can demonstrate really great self-regulation and other times not so much. If they need a nap, or they're hungry, or they're in a very loud, noisy place, or in a new place, or many different influences on behavior. But the consistent ability to do that across contexts is important for them to be successful in relationships, in school, and in life. Because it allows them to engage in goal-directed behavior. So things like learning and forming relationships that are so important to health, both physical and mental health, and well-being. So as evidence, a meta-analysis, which is actually a study of studies, looked at the effects across several studies, and they found that self-regulation in early childhood predicts 25 discrete outcomes in later childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So it positively predicts academic achievement, which I've mentioned already, but it's negatively associated with aggressive behavior. And I mentioned the importance of social relationships, negatively associated with depression, obesity, cigarette smoking, unemployment, and substance abuse. And so self-regulation is something we focus on a great deal in early childhood, both in education settings and also in the context of mental health, because we want children to be able to modulate their emotions, to regulate their behavior, and to use their cognitive functions also to be able to do that. As additional evidence of the importance of self-regulation, Clotre and research groups found in 2018 that experiencing adverse childhood events, which is the ACEs, you may have heard of the ACEs study, it stands for Adverse Childhood Events. They looked at the association between ACEs and symptoms of PTSD, depression, and physical health, indicators of physical health. And they were asking the research question of whether emotion regulation would mediate that relationship, that association. And what this shows, this is a schematic representation of the fact that when you put difficulties with emotion regulation between ACEs and those outcomes, the direct associations disappear. So if we took emotion regulation out of this equation, out of the model, you would have direct associations between ACEs, PTSD, depression, and health. You put difficulties with emotion regulation in, and those direct associations disappear. So that means difficulties with emotion regulation is really the mechanism that connects them. And it makes sense because trauma disrupts emotion regulation because the stress response system responds with fight, flight, or freeze, which is adaptive to survive in a context. So if there is a threat, so you're experiencing some form of interpersonal violence, it's quite adaptive to flee or fight back. That's not adaptive in other contexts, like at work. And so, however, threat is a very powerful stimulus, and it's entrained in the stress response system. It doesn't take very much for that to happen. We evolved to survive, and so that kind of a response to a threat very quickly affects the stress response system and changes our thresholds of response. So rigid patterns can persist long after the threat is gone. Thinking developmentally, on the left side, you can see some of the important social and emotional capacities in early childhood that predict mental health in adolescence and adulthood. So being able to recognize and understand your own emotions and those of others, really critical. That helps you to manage your strong emotions and express them in constructive ways, helps you to regulate behavior, have empathy with others, because if you can recognize your own emotions, that really helps you to be able to recognize emotions in others and to build and sustain positive relationships. These things in early childhood predict emotional well-being, mental health, healthy relationships, and academic and professional well-being in adolescence and adulthood. So we've talked about the positive dimensions of early childhood mental health, but it's also important to note that 1 in 6 children ages 2 to 8 have a mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder. So it is not uncommon. And just to give you a sense of what some of the most commonly diagnosed disorders are among children, ADHD is the most common. And so here it's 9.2% of children ages 3 to 17, but with the caveat that few children are diagnosed at age 3. And reliable diagnosis becomes much more possible at age 6 or 7, because that's when executive functions consolidate. So attention, working memory, and inhibitory control become much more consolidated and stable around age 7. So when children are finishing kindergarten or they're in 1st grade, it becomes much more obvious if a child has an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, especially the hyperactive component, because at that point, most children are able to regulate very well, whereas children with ADHD are going to struggle with it a lot more. And so the differentiation between them and their peers becomes more obvious. I also want to add the caveat that being active is not the same thing as being hyperactive. So keep in mind that couch potatoes are made, they're not born. Our natural state is to be active, but hyperactivity is different. Hyperactivity may seem to be random, and it's just both qualitatively and quantitatively different. So teachers and parents who have or work with children who have been diagnosed with a disorder can explain to you how different that is. 7% of children with behavioral challenges, again, so ages 3 to 17, fewer in that younger age range, but you do see it in children who've experienced trauma, especially, and the same thing with anxiety and depression. Very unusual to be diagnosed, at age 3 or even before school age, but it does happen. And then autism spectrum disorder, it's 1 in 59 children, so not quite 2%. However, and I mentioned the pandemic a few minutes ago, during the first part of the pandemic, so from April to October of 2020, There was a 24% increase in the proportion of mental health visits to the emergency department for children ages 5 to 11, and 31% increase for children and youth ages 12 to 17. And because of this and other similar statistics, these three prominent health organizations, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Children's Hospital Association, declared a national state of emergency in children's mental health in October of 2021. And there have been a number of different efforts to try to address this, both in pediatric primary care, but also beginning as well in early childhood settings to both prevent and promote mental health difficulties. There's also a call for greater mental health supports in schools. So what kinds of things do influence mental health? So I mentioned adverse experiences and trauma at any age influences mental health. Biological factors, there are certainly genetic risk factors, but having a chronic health condition influences mental health. Asthma, diabetes, seizure disorder, cerebral palsy, nutrition has a profound influence on mental health. And exercise also promotes mental health. And there are many different processes that underlie that association, among them oxygenation of the brain, release of greater growth factors in the brain when you're exercising, and improvement of attention after exercise as well. I need to also clarify, sometimes I hear people say that, kids need recess to get energy out, but you know what? Exercise also gives you energy. They're not necessarily getting energy out because they come back more focused and more energetic for their to be able to focus on their schoolwork. So just to differentiate that. And social isolation has a pretty negative effect on mental health, and a lot of people experience that through the pandemic as well. So what are some of the ways that nature can promote well-being? So stress reduction theory was proposed by Robert Ulrich originally in 1984, and it's a psychoevolutionary model in which natural environments have a direct effect on our physiology, and primarily through stress response systems. And there are a lot of different ways that you can measure that. So through blood pressure, heart rate, skin conductance, so physical measures of stress. But some other ways that you can measure it, and the evidence includes things like fewer behavior problems in children with greater access to natural environments, fewer symptoms for children with autism spectrum disorder in neighborhoods with higher tree density. And this is using satellite data imagery, and more pro-social behavior in schoolyards that have been greened among children. So that's the evidence of the stress reduction theory. A cognitive pathway is attention restoration theory. And so many studies that have demonstrated, and I'll go through that evidence in just a few minutes, that spending time in natural environments can improve performance on cognitive tests of attention. And then immune function pathways. So this affects physical health, but also mental health. We'll talk about forest bathing, and participants in forest bathing studies have evidenced increase in natural killer cells and the activity of natural killer cells, increase in T cell concentration, and decrease in adrenaline and noradrenaline, so stress hormones. And some of those effects can last up to 2 weeks after the experience of forest bathing. So these immune system functions also seem to have a positive effect on mental health as well. There are behavioral pathways in terms of time outdoors and physical activity. So if there's green space in neighborhoods, people are more inclined to spend time outdoors and to be active than if there is not available green space. It's much more pleasant for any of you who do outdoor exercise to run or to bike or walk in a place that has a lot of greenery than not. And people tend to go towards those places when they exercise outdoors. And there's social pathways. So people will spend more time outdoors and socialize with others in their neighborhoods and so forth. So greater social cohesion and support, and self-regulation. So I'm going to briefly describe the evidence for some of these pathways and then explain some connections to supporting mental health using natural environments to support mental health. So how we study how nature exposure or experience might be associated with mental health, a couple of different ways. You can use, for example, satellite imagery or evaluation of environments around homes or schools and look at variation in mood or symptoms or disorder or diagnosis as a function of the green space, either the density around that location or the distance to the nearest green space. You can look at the association between the frequency of spending time in natural areas. So this is typically self-reported. People will report how often or how much time they spend in natural outdoor spaces, and then mental health indicators as well. There are nature-focused intervention. So these might be experimental, where you're randomly assigning people to conditions, or quasi-experimental, where, for example, you might be comparing two schools that are similar on many characteristics except for green space, or the quality, quantity, and satisfaction with time spent in green space. So these are some of the methods that are used to study the associations between experiencing green space and mental health. So this first set of studies will look at variation in symptoms or disorders as a function of green space in residential green space density or distance. And this first couple of studies actually were done in public housing complexes. And it's a quasi-experimental study in the sense that people weren't randomly assigned to apartments, but the apartments themselves were pretty identical in every way, except for the window views. And so in one, the density of vegetation near home predicted emotional and cognitive regulation for kids in middle childhood, 8 to 11 years. And in the other, girls with greener views from home had significantly better concentration. So a measure of attention, better impulse control. So that's behavioral regulation and delay of gratification than those without a natural view. And you can see what the contrast is. The two pictures below are from the second study. And then the same group, Faber, Taylor, Wiley, Quo, Sullivan, they are at the University of Illinois, did another study in public housing complexes in Chicago. And they found that when there are green common spaces, kids engaged in twice as much play. They engaged in more creative play, but there weren't differences in other activities. And play is central to development and mental health, and in particular, creative play. So opportunities for play, there are greater opportunities for play in green natural environments as opposed to the barren environments. Across contexts, and across countries, there are consistent positive associations between nature experience and well-being. And so in Japan, forest views were associated with improvement in mood and a reduction in self-reported stress. In Scotland, a study reported the percent neighborhood green space and self-reported stress were inversely associated. So more green space, less self-reported stress. And that controlled for socioeconomic status and demographics. And really, all of these studies are controlling for other factors that could influence mental health. In South Korea, higher residential greenness, and this is another satellite imaging study, was associated with lower levels of internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So internalizing is depression, anxiety, externalizing conduct and behavior disorders, and for both children and adolescents. And those effects were both direct, but also mediated through air pollution exposure. And that's one of a handful of studies that have found associations between air pollution and children's cognitive and emotional status. In the United States, and this is a Southern California study, exposure to green space near home was associated with fewer aggressive behaviors among children and adolescents. Again, controlling for factors, age, gender, race, ethnicity, neighborhood quality, and temperature. And so people may wonder, does it matter if it's winter or summer? Does it matter if it's really hot? I imagine if it's really hot, probably. But in this particular study, it didn't matter. In Germany, there are two large population-based studies of children. So they're following children over time from birth, and they found that the greater the distance to the nearest urban green space is associated with increased odds of hyperactivity and inattention problems and peer relationship problems. But it was not associated with the behavioral, conduct, or emotional problems, with all of the appropriate statistical controls, but including things like screen time, parent education, and maternal age at birth. And then finally, for this set of studies in the Netherlands, they found that more and higher quality green space was associated with better mental health. And the strongest association was found for streetscape greenery, so trees along the sidewalks and streets. And then a second study that found that large areas of green space within a kilometer of home was associated with lower prevalence of anxiety disorders and depression, with a stronger association among children and adults with lower SES. So this is evidence of a buffering effect of green space. And then the People in Nature Survey of England. I just love that England has a People in Nature Survey. So over 1,500 children were interviewed, and they reported that being in nature made them feel very happy. Okay, so turning to some of the experimental or quasi-experimental studies, so the evidence of associations between nature exposure and mental health or well-being. These were some of the earliest studies. Walking in a nature preserve compared to walking in an urban setting. So random assignment to those two walk conditions. Those in the nature preserve had more rapid decrease in their diastolic blood pressure, so quicker recovery. In the second study, there were gallbladder patients in hospital rooms that were randomly assigned to a room either with a nature view or a brick wall. And so it's important that everybody was in the hospital for the same reason. You don't want that to be a confounding factor. So they, in advance, determined that it would be people coming in for gallbladder surgery. So those with a view to a natural space had fewer post-op complications, required less pain medication, and were discharged home earlier. And then the same author, Ulrich, found that when you stress people with a film, and so this is a validated research paradigm, you can show them a 10-minute stressful movie and then follow that with a 10-minute recording of everyday outdoor settings, or a neutral movie. Those who viewed the nature movie more fully recovered from the stressor. And again, these are physiological measures that indicate stress. So skin conductance, pulse transit time, muscle tension, and heart interbeat interval. Walking in an arboretum. So this is experimental design as well, compared to an urban walk. Walking in the arboretum improved working memory and positive affect or positive emotion more than a walk in an urban setting. And in another study by the same authors, walk in nature improved directed attention and mood, but an urban walk did not. And then they had a second part of the study that viewing images of nature improved directed and executive attention, but viewing urban images did not. So these are experimental design. I mentioned forest bathing, and the Japanese Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries coined the term forest bathing, or Shinran Yoku, in 1982. And so it's recognized as a form of therapy. And so there have been several studies on the practice. And so one found that forest therapy was associated with greater improvements in mental and emotional health compared to gardening, yoga, and group therapy. And in an experimental design, participants who were randomly assigned to forest walks reported improved mood and reduced levels of stress and inflammatory markers compared to those assigned to urban walks. They actually did blood draws. A South Korean study found that adults with depression experienced remission of symptoms after 9 days in a forest therapy program, while the control participants did not. And those with the most severe symptoms experienced the greatest improvement. And then another study in South Korea found that forest therapy participants experienced significantly greater stress reduction than controls and larger improvements in mental health. So experimental design, quasi-experimental design, children moving from homes moved to homes surrounded by more natural environments from less natural environments had significantly improved attentional capacity. Children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder had better attention after a 20-minute walk in a park compared to a walk in a neighborhood and a walk in an urban area. And all children participated in all three conditions on different days and in randomized order. The effect size of the improvement in attention was comparable to methylphenidate, which is one of the most commonly prescribed ADHD medications. The authors are careful to note that people shouldn't go off their medication, but think about this as a complementary treatment. And parent self-reports also find this association. So parents with ADD or ADHD responded to an online survey reporting what kinds of activities their kids were participating in, and then reported on their symptoms that same day. And so they reported greater reduction in symptoms after activities that took place in green outdoor settings compared to built outdoor or indoor settings. And then improved for both boys and for girls. And then this is another interesting study of how showing people slides can change their physiology and their affect and attention. And so it doesn't even have to be direct nature. I've mentioned a few of the studies looking at photos or images. And in this particular study, they found that looking at nature with water, nature with vegetation, compared to urban with no water or no vegetation, that the green condition was associated with greater alertness or wakeful relaxation and greater alpha amplitude. And so viewing nature with vegetation versus the urban condition. Okay, so some studies have been done with nature in school as well. Children spend a lot of time in school. We want to know about how different conditions affect their mental health and physical health and learning. And so one study of preschools, this was in Duluth, Minnesota, compared to children attending non-nature preschools. Those in nature preschools demonstrated significantly greater growth in self-regulation, curiosity, and creative thinking. So thinking about that definition of infant and early childhood mental health. Another study compared field trip type to a nature school versus a museum, and those at the nature school reported more positive and negative emotions, a closer connection to nature, greater willingness to protect nature, and more pro-social behavior. Frequency of spending time outdoors and curriculum at school, and this is a quasi-experimental design, so just comparing schools and what they were doing. Girls in the high frequency outdoor implementation schools scored higher on self-regulation compared to girls in the low frequency. And then looking at recess, the total time outdoors at school, kids who spend more time in recess score higher on self-regulation as well. Children have reported that they use natural areas at school to escape from stress, build competence, form supportive social groups, and focus. So the idea of green schoolyards as a refuge. And this is a study that randomly assigned kids to rooms in a school, and it was on a weekend, so just for the assessment, one participant at a time. They randomly assigned them to classrooms either with no windows, a barren view or view of a wall, or a green space. And then they looked at both their subjective and objective attention, stress, and controlled for chronic stress, chronic mental fatigue, and landscape preference. And that's, some people have said, well, maybe people who improve in their attention or mood just like natural landscapes better. So that's why it's important to control for landscape preference. And what they found is that there was a significant difference in attentional capacity after the break. So they had a 5-minute rest to begin with. They had a cognitive challenge and social stress test, so activities that were like what you would do in school. Then they took a 10-minute break and had assessments. So in the green window condition, they had greater attentional capacity after the break, but there was no difference in attention across the no window and barren window conditions. And there was an increase in physiological stress during class activities and a significant stress reduction after the break in the green window condition, and no difference in stress reduction between the no window and barren conditions. So attention restoration and stress reduction, both there's evidence for. So I've mentioned nature as a stress buffer, and there are several studies that have found evidence that it can buffer stressors. And so you can see that psychological distress on the y-axis here, the light colored bars are low nature conditions and the black bars are the high nature conditions. So if you have low, medium, and high stressful life events, but in each of those conditions, you can see that in a low nature condition, participants reported higher psychological distress. And in the high nature condition, they reported lower psychological distress. More green space was associated with fewer total and internalizing behaviors. Again, that's depression and anxiety among children of South Asian origin living in a deprived urban area of the UK, but no association for the white British children in the same area. So evidence of a buffering effect. And importantly, satisfaction with the quality of local green spaces was a more important predictor of well-being than quantity or use of green spaces among South Asian parents. Keep in mind that parents are gatekeepers for their children's experiences, especially very young children. Now, this particular study, this is really fascinating because participants were students who had just completed a class, and so they were cognitively fatigued. They've used their directed attention, and they were randomly assigned to 4 different conditions. These are the images that they were shown, and I apologize, the images on either end are cut off, but what you can see is they're the identical image, except that the images on the bottom have trees in the streetscape. And I mentioned streetscapes previously. And so the conditions were no trees. So some of the participants just saw the 5 images with no trees. There was a minimal awareness condition. So this is where they would see rapid flashes of greenery every 5 seconds for 0.03 seconds. So these are almost sub-awareness levels. So they could notice, but they were not substantially aware of it. A moderate awareness group where they just saw the images with the greenery, and then a heightened awareness where they were instructed to observe the greenery carefully. And so on the left, you see this bar graph. This is a manipulation check. They wanted to see if this differentiated, these 4 levels really differentiated between what people noticed. And so they asked people to report the number of tree species that they saw. And as you can see, the people in the no tree and minimal awareness conditions really couldn't report tree species at all. The moderate awareness and heightened awareness groups could. And then importantly, you see the results on the attention performance tasks. In the no tree condition, there was a decrease in attention. The minimal awareness, and remember, these are flashes. They weren't necessarily consciously aware of seeing those trees. There was statistically significant improvement. There was greater improvement for the moderate awareness and the greatest improvement for the heightened awareness. So trees matter, even if you don't really realize they're there. So just to summarize these findings, using nature to promote mental health, there are findings that exercise in green space leads to greater improvement in mood to indoor exercise. So running outdoors as opposed to the treadmill. In terms of dose, there are improvements in subjective well-being and physiological well-being within 20 minutes, and urban nature can be effective, especially it seems like there is a buffering effect of trees on streetscapes, and a number of studies have sort of pointed to that. Frequency is important, regularity is important. Window views to green spaces can be effective in terms of promoting mental health. An intentional focus on natural surroundings can amplify the effect of that. In terms of young children's mental health, okay, so how can it promote these aspects that I mentioned earlier? If we think about nature experiences as the foundation, and that they're building to, through those experiences and play, to positive emotions, decrease distress, greater executive functions, and greater self-regulation, these capacities help them to form and participate in positive relationships, experience and express the full range of emotions, and explore and learn about the world. So just some examples of how that can happen. opportunities to focus attention and develop empathy and concern. Focusing attention is really a critical component of what we call executive functions, cognitive capacity, and it's important for effective learning and for self-regulation to be able to pay attention to yourself and to others. And the ability to focus attention away from something unpleasant and towards something that's more pleasant is a core ability for emotion regulation. Noticing, attention to details and noticing beauty and connections is both a cognitive and emotional capacity. Thinking about sensory experiences, nurturing curiosity and flexibility, exploring and learning about the world, and keeping in mind that simple experiences can be very powerful. Never underestimate the power of water to promote joy. Opportunities to engage in problem solving and cooperation, play, which is again central to all aspects of development, including mental health. Promoting positive emotions and relationships, shared positive emotions, gentleness. This is a roly-poly, by the way. Most preschoolers can tell you a lot about roly-polies and their needs. Forming and participating in positive relationships and exploring and learning about the world, challenging yourself, using nature as a refuge, experiencing the full range of emotion. These children, preschool age children, are burying a salamander who was their classroom pet. So keeping in mind the importance of human and animal interactions, animals being a part of nature. And I should mention that when we pet dogs, our oxytocin levels rise, which is considered the love hormone, and it's associated with a sense of calmness. And oxytocin is also increased in the dog too. So petting dogs is good for us and it's good for dogs. Simple everyday experiences, sensory experiences, feeling grass on your feet and sunlight and water. And the photo on the right is washing a green pepper out of the garden and eating it. Physical challenges really contribute to positive self-efficacy and self-concept. Sharing moments of peace and beauty with important adults. Focusing attention on and drawing children's attention to rhythms of nature, day and night, seasons and life cycles. Winter is a great time for stargazing because you can see stars by 5 o'clock, maybe 6, before bedtime in any case. Encouraging whole body and multisensory experiences. And this is an example of imagination using loose parts in nature. So open-ended materials really foster and promote creativity. The picture on the lower left is a bed with a snapdragon for a pillow. On the lower right is a bathroom, as you can see from the water. But there's a lot of, the rocks, leaves, flowers, things available in the environment, and then mixing that in with some toys. So some of the way thinking about using nature to support young children's mental health, keep in mind simple experiences, multisensory, noting that time is important, giving children time, being patient, and just allowing them to be. Contemporary children are highly scheduled. They live very busy lives, and spending time in nature allows them to slow down. And that is good for their attention and their ability to, really explore, really immerse themselves. Opportunities for pretend play, open-ended materials, opportunities to challenge themselves, interacting with animals and insects, and developing care, concern, and empathy for all living things. And then I just want to close with this quote from Stephen Keller. The child's experience of nature is an essential, critical, and irreplaceable dimension of healthy maturation and development. And that's often overlooked in our contemporary society. So with that, I'm going to stop screen share and we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. That was amazing. And yeah, if anybody has any last minute questions, you can put them in the chat now. Also, the same poll from the beginning is going to pop up on your screen in a second, and we would really appreciate you filling that out. Let me see. Yeah, other than that, Julia, thank you so much for all of the wonderful information about the relationship between nature and mental health. I mean, especially as we move out of like a COVID-centered world where we're all like isolating inside, I feel like this is just the perfect thing as we transition back to normalcy, you know?
Right, right.
Um, oh yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Are you looking at the questions?
Yeah, I forgot that there was one earlier in chat that I made a note of, because you were talking about how like when someone's in a hospital, if they just can see nature, they heal better. Someone asked if like having flowers in the room with them kind of has that same effect.
That's a great question. Actually, yes. So that initial study of the barren view and the nature view led to additional studies of things like a green wall in hospitals. And so if you've never seen a green wall, it's essentially there are pots embedded within the walls. And I've seen them in airports too, where you have just sort of a wall of plants in a common area. And I think that's one of the reasons why we bring flowers, that beauty. So indoor plants, there have been some studies that indoor plants do make a difference. Um, so that's a great question.
Yeah, I thought so too. We have another question that says, have you looked into the impacts of climate change on well-being?
Mm, that is a whole different field of research. And I'm not familiar with that, with the climate change research, but there is a lot to be examined. I've kind of wondered, there was research, the kids who grew up with duck and cover, there was sociological research on those kids, and they really thought that they weren't going to have a future because there was going to be nuclear annihilation. And I kind of wonder if that might be an experience that children are having and young adults are having at this point. I don't know. That's a great question. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. I'm going to send up a follow-up email, by the way. Melia, if you'll email me back, I think that we do have one webinar on the impact of climate change with mental health. So if you respond to that email, I can try to get that to you. Another great question, because I know you were kind of talking about like, the impact of like having like trees around or just being able to see trees. Do you think that a prairie would have that same effect, just a flat grassland?
That's a really good question. So I know that studies have been done in both a desert environment and arboretum, what we think of as an arboretum with deciduous trees. And they had positive effects in a desert environment. I'm not sure about prairie. I would hypothesize that it would be, although I will share that one of the hypotheses is that trees emit phytonicides, which are aerosolized substances that we breathe and that also get on our skin. And we have, so that those microbes and those substances are actually coexisting with us. And so I don't, that's one of the working hypotheses. And so a prairie wouldn't necessarily do the same thing, but I would hypothesize that you would have similar, for example, reduction in physiological stress symptoms and improvement in mood.
Okay, and we have another question. If children have not had the full outside experience, can we as adults help them with this easily?
Yes. And so this in some ways gets to what kinds of experiences and the dose. So for children, you don't need expansive nature. You don't need to be in wilderness, although wilderness experiences are powerful. It can be a backyard under a lilac bush, digging in the dirt. It can be neighborhood walks, a local park. Because, and especially if children are small, scale is something where if you have some tall prairie grass, they are, that's where they are. They may not even be aware of, other buildings around them. But adults are really important for facilitating these kinds of experiences. And I was noticing within some of the questions, it's really not ever too late to immerse yourself in nature to have those kinds of experiences.
And then someone was interested in the forest bathing. They want to know if you know if there's anywhere they can do that here in Nebraska.
Well, it really is just walking in a tree canopy. And so in Lincoln, certainly Wilderness Park would be a place to do that. That's the place that comes most readily to mind, but you could go to Platte River State Park. Um, there are certainly the, what is the forest in Omaha?
Fontanelle, maybe?
Yes, Fontanelle Forest, that's right. So really, it is just walking in the forest. And with some of these studies, it would be an hour or 2 hours. And, you know, that is sufficient to make a difference.
And then I think we have one more question. It is, does population density affect nature therapy?
That's a really great question. So one of the things that people sometimes raise as a potential confound with nature, the comparisons, if you're doing an urban and a nature comparison, is whether what you're really measuring is a decrease in what people call the allostatic load, which is stress level. So if you think about the amount of stimuli that are impinging upon you at any particular moment. So that's the number of people that you're seeing and the sounds and the cars and so forth. And there's not a great way to control for that. So I would say that population density hasn't been directly studied, but in the studies where they are specifically focusing on urban nature, in a way it is controlled because you'll have urban spaces with and without urban nature. And so I think that part of what might be happening with some of the streetscape greening is that that buffers it. It really changes the experience of walking down a street. And at least in Lincoln, we're really fortunate. Our downtown is really quite nice. I mean, we have the prairie grasses and the flowers and tree canopy on a lot of the streets. Some of them, they're not mature trees yet. But that really buffers the experience that you're having as you're walking down the street.
All right. Yeah, that seemed like all of the questions. Again, if anyone has any last minute ones, throw them in there. Otherwise, just thank you so much. I just really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak with us about this. And thank you everyone that's here for coming to learn with us. Again, my name is Candace Teal with Conservation Nebraska, and I've said it a bunch, but I'll say it again. I'll send up a follow-up email to you tomorrow with some more information from this webinar. And make sure to check out our Facebook page for more upcoming events, and we hope to see you all again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Candace Grace.